Let's cover the infamous Fizz Buzz problem. So many engineers can't get this right, despite it being pretty straightforward. Let's make sure you don't fall into the same trap today. This is AlgoDaily. Let's cover the Fizz Buzz problem. This is a very common interview question that a lot of senior engineers supposedly get wrong, and it could be it's because they're being disingenuous about their years of experience, or it could be that this problem really stumps people. There's a lot of debate about it. We'll make sure that you properly understand how to solve this problem if you ever get it in an interview. So the requirements are pretty straightforward. We're given an integer, and for each number from 1 to the integer, we're going to append a word to a string depending on a few conditions. So the first is if the number is a multiple of 3, we're going to represent it as fizz. If it's a multiple of 5, we're going to represent it as buzz. And if it's a multiple of both 3 and 5, we'll represent it as Fizz Buzz. So here's a little diagram that shows you if you were to enter the number 15 as your input. This diagram sort of illustrates what condition each number would go through. So you can see starting at 1 isn't a multiple of 3, 5, or 3 and 5, so we leave it. Same with 2. 3 is a multiple of 3, so we'll represent it with fizz. 4 doesn't apply. 5 is a multiple of 5, so we'll represent it as buzz. 6 is a multiple of 3, so we represent it as fizz, and so on. And then once we get to 15, it's our first case of a number being a multiple of both 3 and 5. And so we'll represent it as Fizz Buzz. All right, let's go ahead and try to tackle this problem. So given Fizz Buzz with an input of 15, we're going to want to output a string that looks like this. Since we know that we're going to ultimately end up with a string, let's set up a result string that will constantly overwrite and build upon in order to store the final value. Then we can write the function signature for FizzBuzz, and it takes in a number. And ultimately, we're going to have to do some kind of loop. So for now, let's just set up a very basic for loop. We'll do something with result, and then we'll return result. So let's start off by fixing this loop. First, we know that we're going to have to start at 1 instead of 0, because 0 doesn't fall into any of our conditions. Secondly, notice that at the very end here, we get 13, 14, and then FizzBuzz. This means that 15 is included in the final string, and thus we need to make our for loop inclusive. And just adding this equal sign will include 15. Now let's go ahead and address our first initial few conditions. So in order to find out if a number is a multiple of another number, as our requirements specify, in order to find out if a number is a multiple of another number, how do we find out if 1 is a multiple of 3? And how do we find out if 1 is a multiple of 5? Well, we have the awesome modulo operator that we can work with. So let's start there. So we know that one of the requirements is if a number is a multiple of 3, And this is how we find out. What happens is I modulo 3, if the result is 0, then we know that it's a multiple. And then we can write another if statement. You can copy this over. And so we've addressed the 3 and the 5. All right, so we're moving right ahead. We can actually move this result in here. Since we don't want it to be a global function, we want it to be in the scope of the FizzBuzz function. And we can specify exactly what we're going to do in each case now. So I'm just typing out that we're going to append fizz and append buzz in these conditions. And then because we know that each number only gets processed once, we can change this to an else if. And of course, one of the final conditions is if a number doesn't fit into any of the categories, we just add it directly. So here we have a pretty good scaffolding of where people start to get stuck. You've got the for loop going, you've got the two conditions going, and the base case is included as well, and we would return a result. Now, here's where people go wrong with this problem. A lot of people will try to add the third case, if it's a multiple of 3 and 5, over here. But that's incorrect. The reason being is if a number is a multiple of 3 and 5, it's going to get processed by these two first. And since it gets processed by these two first, it'll never actually get to this condition. So in the case of 15, 15 is a multiple of 3. And so we'll end up in this conditional block and never end up in this conditional block. And as a result, what we want is actually to specify that first. So let's modify this a little bit. And you can see now that we check if it's a multiple of 3 and 5 first and add FizzBuzz before checking any of the other conditions to ensure that multiples of both 3 and 5 are properly processed. Let's give it a test drive. Oops, and one correction is that this should be I. Let's save this. And if we log out FizzBuzz 15, we end up with what we expect.